Tired of it yet? The voice reverberated dully inside Shelley's skull. She hardly noticed it at first, rumbling beneath everything like the ambient bass track of some horror-themed auto-narrative. She cocked her head to one side and listened. You look tired. There was nothing to hear, but now that she was paying attention, she could feel the words vibrating noiselessly in her ears. Against the silence of her visitor's voice, everything she said sounded like a shout. "You're back," she said, louder than she meant to. "In the flesh." She raised a skeptical eyebrow at the empty living compartment, trying to decide where exactly she thought the sound was coming from. "You call me a ghost. That doesn't make me one." The voice drew near. She could feel the vague warmth of its presence as it joined her beside the open panel in the wall. She tried to imagine it leaning over her, staring. "I told you you'd get bored with this." Her gaze dropped to her hands. In one, she held the fat, blue-outlined half of a frayed cable snaking out from the opening. In the other, she held nothing at all, although it didn't feel that way. To her, it always felt like she was pinching some kind of short, metal straw between her fingers. The ghost had called it a fuse and had told her it was fixed, but not the way your task feed wants it to be. "It's a little repetitive," she said, bending the invisible trinket back into shape with her forefinger and thumb. "But it's better than running all over chasing jobs I'm going to have to waste time learning how to do." She ignored the yellow highlighted wires poking out of the cable, the glowing instruction text, the arrows outlining the proper repair procedure, and adjoined the cable ends to either side of the fuse. The guides vanished and were replaced with a bright, "Good job," flashing center vision. She watched the number on her wallet tick higher as her reward was deposited. 171,413, 171,414, 415, 416, 4 whole prestige. Barely enough to buy a bagel. She brought up the interface for her compartment's lights, which registered as off even though they looked like they were working fine to her. She tried to turn them back on anyway. Instead, there was the flash of arcing electricity from inside the opening, the barely heard clink of a breaking fuse, and then her task feed notifying her that a new repair job is available nearby. Payout, 4 prestige. Blow the dummy fuse, give it a pinch, replace, profit, repeat. And repeat, and repeat. "Yeah, I bet," the voice said. "It's a good little trick. What's it been, a month since I showed you?" 6 weeks, actually. "Well, sorry for the wait. I've got plenty to think about as is. Can't expect me to keep track of the time, too." She stopped herself from glancing in the voice's direction. There was too much going on inside her head for her to feel altogether comfortable with. If her eyebrows were knit together in thought and she was chewing on the inside of her cheek, she didn't want him to see it. Instead, she pretended to be engrossed in her work. "Oh? Do you have a whole list of poor girls to haunt or something?" "I might." Not precisely the thing she wanted to hear, but it wasn't unexpected. He'd evaded her questions last time as well, always diverting the conversation back to her. He was like an imp, always ready to grant a wish, never willing to share the conditions. She rolled the invisible fuse between her fingers and the heel of her palm. "I don't want to sound ungrateful," she said after a pause. "But yes." "Yes, what?" "Yes, I'm bored." "Oh, no surprises there. I told you you'd be, but I guess there's no medicine like regret." She felt fingers against her palms. The cable lifted from her grasp and turned over in the air, as if under appraisal. A small crater suddenly appeared at the edge of her mattress. "You spent 42 days just..." The cable seemed to gesture at her and the panel behind. "Playing on repeat. Was that everything you hoped it would be?" "Hard work isn't fun. It's just how things are. If I'm ever going to get developer extensions, I'm going to need the prestige. And this, it's tedious, but I don't think there's any better way." "There isn't. Not for your kind. But tell me, how much closer are you after 42 days? She was disturbed by how quickly the answer came. No need to open the extension library, compare what was in her wallet with the download fee. The number was always looming large at the back of her mind, every hard day's work a fleck picked away from the immensity of it. Somnium's official self-design API, yours for only 10 million prestige. She could make about 4 per minute if she was concentrating. If she spent all her time working, which she did, That would come out to 4,008 prestige a day. Only a tidy 6 years and some months of this, and the tools of creation would be at her fingertips. When she'd first come to this number, she'd wept. With hot tears streaming down her cheeks and gut-wrenching fits of convulsive laughter, she'd lain here on the floor and sobbed until her eyes had run dry. She hadn't tried to fight it. It was only her body catching up with her mind as it surfaced from the stagnant waters of resignation. 23 years, lost to the idle regimen of good food, sparse taskwork, and abundance of entertainment and sleep. Her life had been a dream of balance and comfort, but complacence had never seemed to be enough. She needed to do something with her life, something worthy. If only she could afford developer tools, if only there was some way. Her wrists ached. She caught herself rubbing at them and stilled her hands by clasping them together. Is there something you want? You know, there is. She looked up at him, surprised by the uncharacteristic candor. Thought she did, anyway. Really? Oh, sure. The cable dropped onto the floor and the crater disappeared from the mattress. She heard footsteps moving toward the compartment door. What I want is for you to be honest. Now you have a taste of what it's going to be like getting where you want to go. Is that going to be worthwhile? She shrugged. 6 years isn't such a long time. It's a hell of a lot to gamble with. I've told you before, developer tools won't give you what you're looking for. It's just going to be a more expensive way to eat up time. Okay, she said, trying to keep her tone measured. I don't feel that way, but if we were to pretend I did, what could I even do? You said it yourself, this is the best way. I did, and it is. The best way toward the wrong goal. But if what you really want is freedom... There was the sound of something clattering to the ground near Shelley's foot. I can give it to you. I just have to know you really want it. Before she could ask what that meant, the door was opening on its own, and the voice was trailing out into the perpetual stream of bodies outside. I'll see you in 2 weeks, it said. Exactly 2 weeks this time. Think on it. And then, although she could never be entirely sure anymore, it seemed she was once again alone in the small space. They were gone. Renee scoured the compartment one final time. She searched the dark corners of the room, beneath the bed, even looked up. Not a soul in sight. She paused when she realized what she was doing and cackled aloud at the thought of a dirty little person pressed like a spider into the corner of the ceiling. It wasn't actually so funny to her, but after losing 2 shades in a row, she felt an urgent need to either start laughing or sinking her fists into something. This, she thought, was the saner of the two. Fine, she shouted when she was done laughing. The sound of it was very loud inside her helmet. Fine, because 1 wasn't enough. Oh, fuck it all. She meant to give the bed a little kick, but the hydraulics in her boot put more force into the swing than she intended, and one side of the frame buckled into an upward-pointing arrow. She appraised the damage. Well, good. Serves you right, you little parasite. She fought the compulsion to destroy the rest of the room. The door was already lying on the floor with the divot where her boot had impacted it. She glanced at the ill-serviced UV lights flickering from their slits in the ceiling. The floor was strewn with plastic refuse, small containers, scraps of fabric that she couldn't place the origin of. Beside the bed in a stolen shipping crate, there was a mound of food items machine-sculpted from porous white foam. She wrinkled her nose at it. Fungal pulp. Best only to eat on the server, where everything looks and tastes and feels right. Best to do most things on the server when you aren't hunting. It might have brought her a little relief to smash in the flickering lights, trample the collection of trash, upend the vile food crate. She clenched and unclenched her fists restlessly. A little relief, maybe, just to rob them of their vain hoard of things. It reminded her in a less than pleasant way of her own compartment and the tools she had to keep there to do her work. Sunshine slogan number 8. Excess makes the mind grow numb to pleasant dreams insomnium. Straight from the Sunshine Code of Character. It had been among Argos's favorite rhymes. She tried to stop thinking about it. This was a bad month for self-loathing. Things were moving briskly in the dark. By now there would be at least 1 more shade to put down, and property destruction would never be a substitute for pulling the trigger. In a moment, she was back on the server. The patina of black streaks and grime that coated every surface vanished beneath a veneer of glossy onyx. The ugly slit lights, the garbage, the food crate all went as well, invisible and noiseless beneath the dream of augmented reality. Even the mound of white pulp was now a cube of half-eaten fruits and baked goods, floating motionless in the air a finger's breadth above the floor. Better already. At a mere thought, the translucent blue of her client browser was filling her vision. She navigated with her eyes to Somnium's incident report feed and scrolled through a list of client IDs highlighted in red, all except for the two most recent entries. One of them was yellow, the other blue. Renee frowned and marked the blue unresolved yellow. It pained her to have such a blemish on her record. She was beginning to think of ways she might track down the two missing shades, put things right, when something in the queue changed. Before she could spend any time brooding, a new entry appeared. Kyle Sangara 19, basic client, status, offline. Her breath caught in her chest as she expanded the entry. Somewhere in the Omniplex, a client had just betrayed Somnium for the squalor of reality. There was a new shade roaming the transit shafts, and she knew exactly where to find him. Okay, she said to herself, and felt her lips break into a smile in spite of her. Round 3. The other clients dipped and dodged around the glowing obstacles, half of them cloaked in dark silhouettes, all streaming bolts of light at one another from their glowing finger pistols. Shelley watched a beam strike one of them in the chest. His disguise flickered and then vanished, and he collapsed to his knees, one hand clutching dramatically at his simulated wound. A disembodied voice boomed the words, "Player 12 neutralized," and there came a cheer from the uncloaked players. She still didn't quite know what she was doing here. Maybe some part of her had thought a game of Vindicate would help her find a rhythm with the world again. This had been her game once. She'd ranked on the leaderboards. Beside the occasional auto-narrative, it was all she did outside of work. She stood quietly by the back wall, feeling like a child with her finger pistol. 4 days was all it had taken for everything to fall apart after the ghost's last visit. Except for a brief window of research, she'd spent the time defiantly repairing the lights in her compartment, earning over and over her desperate prestige. She didn't want to think about what he'd said, but there was nothing to stop her. The work became more tiring every day. Even a small break was enough for her to feel the seed of doubt he'd planted unfurling inside her and to send her hunting for affirmation. What she had found was an index of developer forum logs. It was nestled deep in the browser, hidden behind the media feeds and game discussions, but nonetheless available for public reading. There were years of audio and visual records there, filled with input from creators everywhere on the spectrum from obscure to ubiquitous. She found a lecture by one Corbin Halls, who had come up with a creative paradigm he called simulated plasticity, a way to prevent protruding aesthetic extensions from clipping through tangible surfaces. Sai Sadhana, another visionary, had shared a treatise on the importance of client color palettes, emphasizing in particular the need for uniformity across accents. A client with golden eyes ought also to have golden fingernails and lips and so on. The most trafficked entry by far was a development journal from a team who claimed to be working on an auto-narrative commissioned by Somnium itself. They said it would be ongoing and would change the way we look at storytelling forever. These were the revolutions of her time, the labors of clients given developer extensions at birth, and they boiled down to a bunch of pretty dressings and fun ways to waste time. In 6 more years, she'd be bordering 30. Could she really expect to come up with something different in the time she'd have left? Would she, a client with no creative background whatsoever, see something none of the veterans had? Was there any hope she'd create something that mattered? Was that even possible? This last question had consumed her. It blotted out her ambitions and overcrowded her mind so that she could hardly think, trapped her in a delirium of fruitless desires and wasted time. Not knowing where she was going or why, she'd abandoned the invisible fuse and frayed cable and wandered out of her compartment. Instead of her usual ventures to the baths, the food dispenser, and then back to her compartment, her feet had guided her like a sleepwalker to old destinations of habit. The great dining hall with its floating neon chandeliers, the promenade with its glass walls and blue sky, and finally, this, the oldest and most familiar of all. It was the fever dream that had drawn her to the game. The world was whirling about her with its dizzying overabundance of stimuli, but there was something here that steadied her. Instead of playing, she stood amid the commotion and watched the clients move around the intangible obstacles as if they were really there, watched them pretend it might mean something if the bolts of light struck them, watched them react with real emotion to the progression of the game. And in each of their places, she saw herself. The whole thing was a satire, an absurd reenactment of all the years she'd spent in this room playing make-believe. Trembling, she opened the interface for Vindicate. At the bottom of the list was the word Exit, which turned from blue to yellow as her eyes scanned over it. A moment later, the giant metal pillars and ridges that had served as cover were gone. The clients were all uncloaked and aiming their bare fingers sporadically at one another. It made her feel sick. All of it. The same empty kind of sick she felt when she woke up in the morning. Every moment of wanton time-filling, every shred of over-exuberance. Even the walls were too much for her, all glossy, curved onyx and golden brass trim. She ran her fingers along one of them as she filed through the client-filled halls and imagined the sensation of dirt accumulating beneath her nails. There was no sleep for her that night. She didn't want to dream. All she wanted was to sit awake on her mattress, cradling the invisible thing the ghost had left behind. The weight of it was somehow reassuring in her hands. Meaningful. She caressed what she thought might be a handle, and then something else like a flat face at the opposite end. With the finger that had been masquerading as a pistol not half an hour ago, she traced the shape of something curved in metal. A trigger of some kind, maybe. 10 more days, she whispered to herself. After an hour of waiting, Renee finally decided that no one was coming. She glared at the door from across the transit shaft, every muscle in her body wound tight with anticipation and rage. Just holding the gun in her hand instead of crumpling it like paper with her hydraulic gloves took genuine effort. Instead, she pressed her teeth together until her temples hurt. 13 shades lost in almost as many days. There was an epidemic of hauntings spreading through the server, and she hadn't been able to do a thing to stop it. Her record had become so riddled with yellow over the last several weeks that Somnium had begun to forward her hunts to the other Sunshine kids. It wasn't her fault the Shades were all suddenly so aware. They weren't supposed to know when she would arrive or how to cover their tracks. They shouldn't have been able to bait her into chasing one of them while another two slipped away. This was the first time she'd seen them organize in more than a decade. There had been some uncertainty in the ranks about what it had meant at first. Now it was clear to anyone who knew their rhymes. Sunshine slogan number 3. Shadows gather round their caster, to end the shades and their master. There was a Shademaker in the Omniplex. Some of the others would have ideas for how to put it down, but she hadn't had the opportunity to confront one since she was only a dawnbeam under her mentor. If Argos were still here, this never would have happened. He'd been on her mind a lot since the beginning of all this. Their last hunt together. The way he had looked at her as the shades had poured in and surrounded them. Calm, unperturbed, almost serene right until the end. The only thing that had rippled his cool complexion was Renee's flight. She remembered the way his face fell as she pushed through the crowd of filthy bodies to save herself. The disappointment. It was the last memory she'd ever have of him. She'd been 16 years old. And now, after so many years, there was another Shademaker casting shadows. Beyond Argos's disappointed face and the frustration of failure, all she could think of was sweet catharsis, the release of finding whoever was responsible and holding them in her hands, feeling their flesh like putty between her fingers and the popping of their brittle bones. Argos had once told her that this work should be her duty, not her pleasure. But he was gone, and she couldn't imagine anything in the Omniplex that would bring her more joy. She waited, crouched in the food dispenser alcove, and continued to watch. It was all she could do not to leap across the shaft and barrel through the door. She knew someone was inside this time, had even heard them moving. If it wasn't the Shademaker, it would at least be one of the poor clients they'd converted. Mercy wouldn't be as good as relief, but it would be better than anything she'd done in 2 weeks. She tried to bring up the time in her vision, and then remembered that she wasn't on the server. With a scowl, she looked at the watch built into her glove. An hour and a half had passed. Still no sign that the shade had any intention of leaving. The correct thing would have been to continue waiting. She knew this. If you set a trap, you wait until it springs. Argos had made a habit of reiterating this at every opportunity. She looked at the magnetic discs she'd pinned at each corner of the doorway, the wire twined between them. Where was the point? What could they do that she couldn't? The problem was never that she couldn't handle a shade. The problem was that she'd been missing them altogether. Why should she wait in the shadows like one of them when she had her prey cornered? She lurched out of the alcove, careful not to brush with any of the clients passing back and forth in the transit shaft. The snare triggered harmlessly around her glove as she ripped it away, and the door was like foil beneath her boot. There, a woman, standing at the center of the compartment. A shade so fresh she still looked like a client. No ill-fitting fabric to hide her nakedness, clean except for the black filth of reality coating her hands and feet. But unlike the other clients who drifted through the Omniplex with the beauty of somnium filling their eyes and ears and fingertips, this one was aware. She could hear the incessant buzzing of the UV lights all around and the never-ending whir of machinery, could see the rust-colored walls and the labyrinth of dim, windowless shafts, could see Renee standing in the doorway. A breath. That was all the time it took for the door to come down and for Renee to level her pistol at this sad creature. It was enough for her to manifest in her mind all of the loathing and pity she felt for it, but not enough for her to respond to the realization that something was terribly wrong. The shade should have been terrified. She should have seen Renee's blazing visor and scrambled away into the corner of the room, vermin fleeing from the light. Instead, she stared curiously, blinked. And then the moment passed, and suddenly Renee was falling. She heard the unmistakable clink of 4 metal discs coming together behind her, felt the wires wrapping around her limbs. With a whiplash-inducing jerk, her knees and elbows came together, collapsing her body into a neat, tightly curled package on the floor. As the revelation of what was happening washed over her, she thought she might start to scream. She wanted to buck against her constraints, roll back and forth like an angry child on the filmy ground. Her mouth opened to spray the inside of her helmet with a torrent of curses and spittle. All that came out was laughter. Spasmodic bursts of uncontrollable cackling, wrenching painfully out of her abdomen and throat. It was a funny joke, catching her with one of her own traps. The funniest thing anyone had ever thought of. It had to be. She had to believe it or go mad with rage. This, she thought, was the saner of the two. The shade's expression shifted from curiosity to pity as she watched the display unfolding in front of her. Somewhere beneath the tumult of her mind, Renee wondered whether the shade could see the tears streaming down her cheeks and the snot dribbling out of her nose. "Oh no," the shade cooed, kneeling beside Renee. She placed a tender hand on Renee's visor, as if holding her cheek. "He said it might go something like this, but I never imagined it would be so." She seemed to search for the right word, and Renee thought pathetic was the only real option. "Heartbreaking. I know you don't know any better. I'm so sorry we have to put you through all of this." The shade rose slowly onto her feet and hefted something off the floor from beyond Renee's constrained field of view. It looked like some kind of metal rod or pipe. "There is one thing I can offer you, though. I don't expect you to accept my help, but if it's relief you want, think about the lights. Every one of us, the shades who got away, think about our compartments. Think about what the lights were like inside." She reeled back, holding the pipe like a club over one shoulder. "I'm sorry. Good luck, Sunshine Kid." Renee heard the brief sound of impact, felt the jolt of forward momentum, and then saw black. "I said you looked tired before, but..." There was no slow realization this time. Shelley had been waiting. She noticed the silent vibration of the voice thrumming in her ears almost immediately and twisted around to face its source. "It's you," she tried to say, but cut herself off. Her voice was like gravel in her throat. "Yeah, more or less." The voice seemed to come closer, perhaps leaning in to have a better look at her. "Have you been sleeping much?" She licked her dry lips, shook her head hesitantly. "No?" He grunted. "You want to tell me why?" She did. She also knew that articulating what was in her head would be like trying to explain the meaning of a color. It made sense to her, was woven into the fabric of her life and experiences, the whole cloth of her entire world. How was she supposed to translate into words the impossible disgust she felt for everything she'd ever known? How was she supposed to communicate what that meant? She swallowed hard, felt her tongue stick to the back of her throat. "Prestige," she began hoarsely, "is a very bad substitute for real incentive." For the first time, the voice gave her something that felt like affirmation. It was only a chuckle, but it warmed her. "Eloquent," he said. "Go on." "I always thought there would be something after the games and entertainment and the pleasantness. For some reason I thought if I could just make something, maybe that would be worth my while. And, there were always those developer extensions. It just made so much sense to me for so long. I never stopped to think." She let her shoulders fall. She'd already shed all her tears waiting for the ghost to come back. She squeezed her eyes shut instead and clung to the soothing shape of the invisible thing he'd left with her. "I see why you've been haunting me now. I get it. I've hardly been able to leave this room since I figured it out. I can't bear it. None of this," she gestured with a limp hand at the world around her, "is worth what I was ready to pour into it. I don't want to be like the other clients, and I don't want to be the one who enables them to live like zombies. If all life amounts to is some game or auto-narrative, I'm sure there has to be an exit button somewhere, right?" She turned her gaze up, imagined that she was staring into his eyes. "Do you know where to find it?" A sigh wafted out of the air. "If I say yes, are you going to be surprised? You've always known where I stand." "Why didn't you say anything? Why put me through this?" "I told you. I have to know you really want it. I have to believe you when the words leave your mouth." The voice was close now, so close she thought she could feel its breath. "So tell me, and we'll see if I do. Do you want to be free?" That last word sent a wave of constricting tension through her body. She squeezed the cool metal object in her hands, felt the heat rise into her cheeks and chest. The whole of her banal existence played out across her fevered mind, making her sick with a sleeplessness she'd never realized she had. She was saying the word before she had chosen what to say. "Yes." "Even if it means you never get to go back? What if you regret this?" She rose onto her knees, the object still grasped tightly in both hands. "Please." She hadn't expected the desperation in her own voice, but did nothing to hide it. "Anything is better than this." "Anything? You're sure?" She shook the thing convulsively, as if she were shaking his shoulders. "Please." She was answered by the sensation of rough hands on the back of her own. Slowly, they guided her fingers to the object's handle, curled one of them around the trigger. Together, they lifted it and pressed its cool, flat surface against her temple. "You do it then. Free yourself." She squeezed the trigger. All of her anxiety and helplessness discharged from the pistol in a strobe of blinding white. She felt herself vanish into the emptiness, body limp and useless someplace outside of herself. If this was death, it was already better than the facade she'd been conned into living for 23 years. Any escape was worthy. But soon the purity of the void was fading, and she was beginning to wake. What she thought had been the veil of death dissolved into dazzling motes and purple spots, like lights temporarily burned into her vision. She was returning to herself, starting to feel her fingers and the throbbing in her head, and her painful dry throat, somehow far more noticeable now than before. Except for a dim glow flickering from the slits in the floor and the ceiling, everything was dark. At some point she must have fallen off the mattress. Slowly, shakily, she attempted to rise to her feet. She raked her nails clumsily across the floor in the process, and this time when she felt the grime accumulating beneath, she knew it wasn't an illusion. She looked with mingled disgust and intrigue at the black crescents that should have been the pristine tips of her nails, looked at the filth climbing up her forearms and shins, the floor, the walls, The ceiling, all black, but not like the glazed onyx she knew. She could sense every visceral detail of it, even the smell, like so much waste smeared over every surface. She cast her eyes about for some sign of the ghost. Her only company was the thing that wasn't actually a pistol in her hand, and the panel hanging from one loose screw across the room, wires crammed haphazardly behind. She opened her mouth to call out, but paused. In the hall outside, above the sound of shuffling feet that she knew had to belong to the swarms of zombie clients caught up in the dream, she heard something pounding closer. A moment later, the door was folding in on itself, wrenching free of the frame. It fell into a heap on the floor. From the darkness of the empty doorway, she saw something staring back at her. It was the grinning face of the sun. Renee grinned beneath her visor. She imagined her face was a reflection of the holographic mask projected over it, wrinkled with wild, indignant glee. This one was as afraid as the other should have been. There were no tricks or traps to keep her from doing her work now. She could tell by the wide eyes staring back at her, the way it staggered backward as she entered the compartment. Just the shade and the sunshine now, the way it was always meant to be. Argos would have reprimanded her if he'd known. Any Sunshine Kid would have. When she'd awoken alone and unbound, a bruise throbbing painfully at the base of her skull, she should have gone back to her terrace and explained the situation. They would have worked something out. Some kind of sweep, probably. But then there had been the strange shade with her strange offering, and the lights flickering in a trail through every compartment she'd stormed. All it had taken to find the pattern was a quick look at their service histories and the task records associated with them. It was a thread of exploits, clients using a clever loop to farm prestige from Somnium's Repair and Repay program. Some of them had only been doing it for weeks, others years, but they all terminated in the same way. The inevitable illegal exit from the server. This was where the trail ended. This pale girl, cowering under Renee's gaze, as fresh a shade as any she'd seen. Only minutes would have passed since her conversion. Renee had hoped to arrive fast enough to catch the Shademaker before they were done, but there was the glint of something in the Shade's hand. Renee knew that shape. The wheels in her head seemed to stop turning at the sight of it. Only one thing was clear. "You don't have to put on a show for me," she said with a song in her voice. She didn't mean to sound that way, but it matched the smile that was stabbing painfully at her cheeks. "You should be scared. I'm going to do really terrible things to you. Shelley, isn't it? You don't have to pretend we're strangers, do you?" The girl collapsed onto the ground as Renee drew near, crawled into the corner between the wall and the bed like a wounded animal. "Oh, what?" she stammered. "Oh, you silly thing." Renee crouched so that their faces were less than a foot apart, separated only by her visor. Her shadow fell over the girl's trembling form like a pall. "Full of games and ploys and fun right up until the end. Here," she said, taking the hand the girl was holding the pulse gun with between both of hers. "I've got something we can try out this time. I just came up with it. It's called the breaking game. We're going to see what happens when each part of your body breaks, and then, at the end, we're going to decide which one was the best. How's that?" The girl remained quiet. It was almost impressive. If she were a Shademaker trying to play the part of a shade, Renee was sure she'd have broken character by now. Would have resisted, at the very least. Maybe tried to escape. Instead, the Shademaker only stared in mute horror as Renee began to tighten her grip. And so their fun began. It began with the unbelieving gasps as the pressure increased, and the soft pop of displaced knuckles and carpals. The breaths rose into frenzied, incoherent bargaining, which climbed into screams as the tendons were set free beneath the skin. They snapped away from their anchors like elastic. Tack, tack, tack. And now the metal frame of the gun and the brittle bones were collapsing together. The flesh oozed from between her fists as they closed, indistinguishable black pulp that glistened under the flickering lights. She splayed open her hands in front of the Shademaker's face, viscous fluid drawn into bridges between her fingers. "There. Pretty good start, huh?" The Shademaker made a pathetic sound and tried to wedge herself more tightly into the corner. She held the ragged mess that had once been her hand away from the rest of her body like she couldn't stand to have it touch her, eyes squeezed shut, face turned away. Renee giggled like a child. Real joy now. Better than what she'd been putting on to protect her from the mania of failure. Next, how about... She rubbed her chin, pretending to scan the Shademaker's body for another mark. Ooh, this looks fun. She pinched the Shademaker's ear between her forefinger and thumb. The cartilaginous tissue peeled away like dead skin, and the red came pouring out in a sheet of sweet catharsis. She crushed one of the Shademaker's feet beneath her boot, and the sound of it was release. Fingers, toes, teeth, and nose, all fodder for Renee's game of feel better. They passed the time together. Soon the Shademaker's shuddering was beginning to slow, body lolling uselessly to one side or the other. Renee tried to shake the consciousness back into her several times, but she was either too shocked or too thoroughly bled for recovery. Her flesh had turned the same off-white shade as food pulp. Renee smiled sickly at the thought. Well, she said with a sigh, I guess the game has to end sometime, huh? But you know... She pressed her thumb to the center of the Shademaker's forehead. I have a really good hunch this is going to win. Not just because of what'll happen when I start to push, and she began to apply gentle pressure with her thumb, but because after you, your shades will be a joy to clean up, and then the Omniplex gets to sleep easy again. Yay! No shades running around, trying to wake everyone and everything up. How about that? The Shademaker's face contorted into a noiseless, toothless, blood-spattered agony as Renee's thumb pushed through the tissue. Shh, I know. Just think of it the way your little shade with the long hair thought of sending me here. A mercy. I'm putting you and Somnium both out of your misery. Trust me, she cooed, and the Shademaker's skull finally caved in around her hand. This is all for the best. When she was done, she rose to her feet. Her gloves were dripping, face wet with sweat, a dull ache still throbbing at the back of her head. But she couldn't stop the smile. A Shademaker, on her own. It was an atonement, both to herself and the terrace, for all of her recent stumbles. She turned to leave, and then paused, transfixed by something that was not meant to be there. It was a black box, staring at her from a metal rectangle in the middle of her vision. Before she could process what it meant, the world vanished into a strobe of white light. 3 thoughts occurred to her in the emptiness. First, that what she had seen was a pulse gun, and she'd been shot with it. Second, that her helmet should have stopped it from happening, and it hadn't. Third, that she could swear Argos was speaking to her from somewhere. I always knew you'd have teeth, he said, in the same gruff voice she remembered from her childhood. But this is a mess, Renee. Look at what you did to that poor girl. Is looking like a Shademaker really enough to deserve that? She steadied herself with one outstretched arm against the bed. They'd given her dummy strobes in training, and this wasn't much different. Soon the white was dissolving away into purple after-images, and there, beyond the waning blindness, stood her old mentor. There was no helmet on his head. No blazing, grinning sun to hide his face from the deviants in the shadows, and his hydraulics were missing, but he still wore the black uniform of a sunshine kid. In his hand, the same brick-shaped gun she'd crushed not 10 minutes ago. Is this all they could make of you? A bloodthirsty pet to ferret out shades? He looked at her with his dark eyes. It was as if the disappointment had never left his features at all. It doesn't matter now. They'll be coming for you like you came for her. You know that. He stared at her for a long moment, and then let out a breath through his nose. His expression seemed to soften. Back then, it wasn't an ambush, you know. It was an intervention. There's more to this world than you'll ever see hunting shades and pandering to Somnium's every whim. There are other omniplexes, Renee, where clients aren't cattle. I always bought the rhymes and all that. If anyone knows that, it's you. But then I got to see the world. You wouldn't look back then. Maybe now, though, you'll understand. He flinched, threw his hands reflexively in front of him as if it would make a difference. Renee's bullet made a hole in his palm, and then his temple, and then the speech came to an abrupt end. She stood between the lifeless bodies of the Shade and the Shademaker, pistol blast ringing in her ears. Beneath the years of training in rhymes, some far distant part of her mind strained to understand. Should this have been a grand epiphany? Should Argos's slackened expression mean something to her? If there was an answer, she didn't know it. Everything was lost in the upwelling madness. Her body shook with an inexpressible mingling of fury and disbelief at Argos's betrayal, his death, hers. She swallowed hard and tried the server. All that came to her was the weight of reality, no longer just a nightmare. Her lips curved into a tremulous smile. The laughter flowed out of her like blood from a wound, pouring, and nothing she could do to stop it. Funny, she thought, how easy this had made her job in the end. A shade and a shademaker in the same night. 2 is a good record. It wouldn't be much effort now to make it 3. The compartment door gaped at her from across the room, and the world beyond was dark and new and waiting to welcome her. She looked at the pistol in her hands. It seemed like the saner of the 2. Well, that was an interesting experience. Who knew Sci-Fi Month was going to take us there? This is our longest story so far, and of course it ended up brimming over with more implications and symbols than we had time to do justice. Maybe you can take it a bit further in the comments. Break down some of the abstractions we lost in the character arcs, bring to light some of the hidden allegory. We always love to read the input you have to offer. Often you show us sides of our work we never would have noticed on our own. At any rate, thanks for being patient with us. These series are all very sizable projects, and they sometimes take longer than anyone can reasonably predict. If one short story a month leaves you craving more, perhaps you can slake your thirst for fiction with Audible.com. They host works by far more infamous writers than ours, read by voices far more talented than I. Lately, the Foundry team has been listening to the complete H.P. Lovecraft Omnibus Volume 2, compiled and read by Finn J.D. John. It's been incredibly convenient for our humans to absorb the stories while they work on other parts of the videos. If you want to join in, you can get your copy of the audiobook for free by visiting our Audible page. Start a free 1-month trial, and you'll unlock 2 free audiobooks of your choice. And, of course, it definitely doesn't hurt that it's just a free way to support the show. For a more intimate way to contribute, you can also join us on Patreon, where you'll have access to monthly votes to help us decide on themes, sneak peeks, even think tank sessions where you'll get to talk to the team about each video before it comes out. Without our patrons, this show would not be possible. So to everyone who helps us make it happen, thank you. And a special thanks to our top patrons, Nick Meyer, Ark D'Angelo, and Vasily Herbinka. Your support is actually unbelievable. Especially Nick, your pledge is very generous. Thank you. You're all helping us more than we can express. Anyway, that's all for our sci-fi series. Thanks for watching, and keep making stuff up. We'll see you next month. Bye!